Jelly Roll has filed for divorce from his wife, Bunnie XO, after nearly 10 years of marriage. Reports are that the decision was mutual. It's a private family matter.
At 41 years old, Jelly Roll sat down and said something that changed everything. Not in an interview with a famous talk show host. Not on social media where everyone could see it coming. He quietly admitted the real reason behind his divorce from Bunnie XO. And the truth was nothing like what the world had been guessing. For months, people had theories. Some said it was the fame. Some said it was infidelity again. Some said they just grew apart. But when he finally spoke about it, his words revealed something much deeper. Something he'd been carrying alone for years. Something that explained why two people who survived a van together, who survived betrayal together, who survived addiction and pain together, simply couldn't survive success. Most people remember the love story. They remember when Jelly Roll and Bunnie XO felt like proof that broken people could build something beautiful. The internet watched them. Millions of fans believed in them. They had become symbols of redemption, of second chances, of love that could actually conquer everything. But here's what most people don't understand about beautiful love stories. Sometimes they're beautiful not because they last forever. Sometimes they're beautiful because of exactly how long they do last, knowing the whole time that they probably won't. In the summer of 2015, two people met who absolutely should not have worked together. He was sleeping in a van named after his pain. He had $500 to his name and a dream that felt impossible. She was living a completely different life. By every rule that the world uses to measure compatibility, they made zero sense. But then something happened that nobody could explain. She looked at him and felt like she'd finally found the person she'd been searching for her entire life. He looked at her and felt like someone actually saw him. Not the version he was pretending to be. Not the version people wanted him to become. But the real him underneath all of it. What they didn't know back then was that this feeling, as powerful as it was, came with an invisible expiration date. Not because they didn't love each other. But because love, all by itself, sometimes isn't enough to survive what comes next. And that's exactly the lesson he finally shared at 41. They met in Las Vegas, and the story almost sounds too romantic to be true. He was performing for maybe 20 people in a tiny venue. Nobody knew his name. Nobody cared about his music. He was just another struggling artist trying to convince the world that he had something worth listening to. She was there that night, but she wasn't there for him. She was with someone else entirely. By all the normal rules of life, they should have never spoken to each other. They should have never exchanged numbers. They should have definitely never fallen in love. But something shifted that night. Something neither of them could explain or control. When he talks about it now, he doesn't use romantic words. He doesn't pretend it was destiny or fate. He's honest about it in a way that actually makes it more powerful. He says she wasn't even his type. He says he loved Taylor Swift music and she was living a completely different life. On paper, they made absolutely no sense whatsoever. But there was something beneath the surface that neither of them could ignore. They built a friendship first. That's important to understand. While the world thinks they just fell into romance immediately, the real story is different. He would text her asking for advice about his daughter. She would actually listen and actually care. She didn't just hear his words. She heard his desperation. She understood what it felt like to be broken and trying to figure out how to be whole again. And somewhere in those conversations, friendship transformed into something neither of them could run from anymore. By the summer of 2016, exactly 1 year after they met, he grabbed a microphone at a concert and asked her if she would marry him that very night. Not in a year. Not after they had more money or a better plan. That night? In Las Vegas. At a little chapel with almost no one watching. She said yes. And two people with nothing but faith in each other drove straight to get married. This is the part that people always focus on. The spontaneity. The romance. The rebellion against every normal rule. But here's what most people miss about this moment. He didn't just marry a woman that night. He married into instant parenthood. He had a daughter already. He had a newborn son with another woman. She walked into chaos with her eyes completely open. She didn't hesitate. She didn't ask for time to think about it. She became a stepmother immediately, to two children who weren't hers by blood, on a budget that barely existed. And she got sober for those kids. Think about that for a second. She changed her entire life to build a family with him. This was the foundation they were pouring together. With their bare hands. With nothing but each other. With absolute certainty that they could survive anything as long as they stayed together. But then, only 2 years into their marriage, something shattered. And when it broke, it didn't break cleanly. It broke the kind of way that leaves permanent cracks. In 2018, Bunnie discovered that her husband had been unfaithful. This wasn't some drunken mistake that he immediately regretted and confessed to the next morning. This wasn't a single lapse in judgment that he felt terrible about. By the accounts that came out later, this affair stretched across almost an entire year. A full year of lies. A full year of deception. A full year of him coming home to a woman who believed in him completely while he was building something on the side with someone else. Think about what that moment must have felt like for her. She had given up her entire previous life. She had become sober for his children. She had poured everything she had into building this family. And the one person she trusted completely, the person who was supposed to see her and value her after a lifetime of feeling disposable, had turned around and made her feel exactly that way again. Disposable. She packed up her life and went back to Las Vegas. And by every reasonable measure, that should have been the end. The marriage was finished. They were done. Nobody would have blamed her for walking away and never looking back. The story could have ended there with two people who tried something beautiful and it didn't work out. But it didn't end there. Years later, when he finally spoke about that dark chapter, he didn't hide from it. He didn't make excuses. He didn't try to shift the blame or soften what he'd done with pretty words. He admitted openly that he was surrounded by people who were cheating, surrounded by people who were lost in drugs and chaos. He said he became a mirror of whatever he chose to stand beside. He owned the wreckage. All of it. No apologies for how he worded it. Just raw honesty about a man who made terrible choices and hurt the person who loved him most. And Bunnie, in her own time, eventually reframed the whole devastating chapter. She wrote that their castle built in sand had to crumble so they could rebuild on solid ground instead. Beautiful words. Forgiving words. Words that sound like healing. But here's the thing nobody talks about. Forgiveness doesn't erase the wound. It just means you decide to keep going anyway. And she admitted something crucial that most people glossed over. It took years for her to believe he actually loved her again. Years. Not months. Years before she stopped feeling like something that could be thrown away. And that wound, even though it healed, left a scar that never completely disappeared. Here's the cruel irony that nobody likes to talk about. The harder these two fought to repair what was broken, the more the world around them began to change in ways they couldn't control. And success, real success, has a way of separating people who were once glued together by struggle. In the years after they reconciled, both of them started building something they'd never had before. Money. Stability. Actual futures that didn't depend on survival mode. And with that came opportunities that pulled them in completely opposite directions. She launched a podcast. Just like that. No massive budget. No famous co-host. Just her voice, and the willingness to talk about things other people were too scared to discuss. The podcast grew. Not slowly. It exploded. Within a few years, she was getting over 1 million downloads every single month. She wasn't the woman quietly waiting at home for a struggling artist anymore. She had become a star in her own right. She had her own audience. Her own income. Her own platform where millions of people tuned in every single week to hear what she had to say. She had built an empire out of nothing, just like he had. But things were about to change in a way neither of them expected. Meanwhile, his music career went from impossible to unstoppable almost overnight. The struggling rapper from inside that white van suddenly had #1 songs. Award show trophies. Sold out arenas all across America. He went from playing to 20 people in a tiny bar to filling stadiums with thousands of screaming fans. This wasn't gradual success. This was meteoric. This was the kind of rise that usually takes a decade, and he did it in what felt like the blink of an eye. In late 2023, they went back to that same chapel in Las Vegas where they got married. They renewed their vows. She called herself the luckiest girl alive. There are videos of them both crying. Real tears. Real emotion. It looked like the perfect moment. Like proof that they'd finally made it through all the pain and come out stronger on the other side. But here's what nobody wants to admit about fame. It's not just heavy. It's isolating. It's lonely. And it spreads the people you love in completely different directions. He was constantly on the road. Tour after tour after tour. Stadium after stadium. He was building something massive, and it required him to be everywhere except home. She was building her empire too. Her podcast was growing. Her brand was expanding. She was becoming someone who didn't need him to be complete anymore. Two people who had once survived together inside the cramped space of a single van were now living lives so enormous and so separate that they barely saw each other. That's when the distance started growing. Quietly. Invisibly at first. But growing nonetheless. These two never pretended their marriage was like everyone else's. Bunnie had spoken openly about this many times. They didn't operate by the same rules that most couples lived by. She had been a working girl. He had been a street hustler. Two people who came from completely different worlds don't love each other the way people raised behind white picket fences do. Their relationship wasn't open in the traditional sense. She described it as free, different, built on a completely different foundation than what most people picture when they hear the word marriage. For years, that difference was actually their superpower. It was the secret to how they survived things that would have destroyed normal marriages. They had their own rules, their own understanding, their own way of being together that worked because they both agreed on it. But something shifted when they became famous. The thing about being famous is that the whole world suddenly has opinions about your marriage. They have expectations. They want your relationship to look a certain way. They want it to fit into boxes that make sense to their own lives. And when you're trying to navigate a marriage that was never supposed to fit into normal boxes, having millions of people watching and judging becomes unbearable. In the spring of 2025, he sat down for an interview and said something that almost nobody paid attention to at the time. He warned that anybody who believes a marriage is one-size-fits-all is eventually going to end up divorced. He said that any couple who thinks their relationship fits neatly into some standard mold is heading for an ending within the next decade. On the surface, he was talking about other people. About the general public watching at home. About marriages that don't work because they're trying to be something they're not. But listen to those words again now, knowing what we know now. He wasn't talking about other people anymore. He was quietly describing his own marriage. His own pressure. His own situation slowly crushing him from the inside. That was the closest thing we have to an actual admission. What happened next shocked everyone. He kept saying pieces of it in different interviews. Different podcast appearances. Different moments that seemed random at the time but suddenly made sense when you put them all together. He kept telling us, over and over, that a marriage only survives when both people keep choosing the same unusual shape together. Again and again. Every single day. Making the same choice. Staying inside the same boundaries. Accepting the same rules. The chilling implication underneath all of that is painfully simple. Somewhere along the way, one of them stopped fitting that shape. The very freedom that once held them together so tightly slowly hardened into the distance that finally pulled them apart for good. And that's the part he could never say directly. That's the part that was too uncomfortable. Too raw. Too honest about what really went wrong. For years, there was one dream that neither of them could let go of. A dream that success hadn't given them yet. A dream that no amount of money or fame could actually guarantee. They wanted a child of their own together. A baby that was theirs. A new life that belonged completely to both of them. But her body kept making that dream nearly impossible to reach. She spoke about it with brutal honesty in interviews. Blocked tubes. Medical procedures that didn't work. Losses that she grieved quietly, without cameras watching. Fertility treatments that went so wrong that doctors had to force her into a medically induced version of menopause just to save her health. This wasn't some casual thing they mentioned in passing. This was a year-long battle fought almost entirely in private. Countless tears. Countless disappointments. Countless moments where she probably wondered if this was actually going to happen. Most couples would have given up. Most couples would have accepted that it wasn't meant to be and moved forward. But these two didn't give up. They kept fighting. They kept trying. They kept believing that somehow, someway, this dream was still within reach. And then, in the early part of 2026, something incredible happened. They announced that they had found a surrogate. A real surrogate. This was actually going to happen. They were going to have twins. Using her eggs and his genes. 2 babies. 2 new lives. The dream they had whispered about on their very first night together was finally becoming real. They were so excited. You could see it in their faces. You could hear it in their voices. This was the thing that all the success had been building toward. This was the missing piece. Think about what that timeline looked like. Early 2026. They're announcing twins. They're standing together at award shows. They're thanking each other with visible tears. They're talking about the future. About becoming parents together. About finally completing the family they'd always wanted. The cameras caught all of it. The hope. The joy. The certainty that everything was finally falling into place. But then something happened that nobody saw coming. Within just a few short months, everything changed. The same man who had spoken so tenderly about those babies, who had cried on stage about becoming a father, was quietly writing down a separation date. He was hiring a divorce attorney. He was filing paperwork in Williamson County, Tennessee. On the 18th of May, 2026, he officially filed to end his marriage. The reason listed was irreconcilable differences. Legal language for 2 hearts that simply couldn't find their way back to each other anymore. But here's what made it even more devastating. The separation date he chose was the 9th of May. 1 day before the official filing. 1 day before the court documents made it real. On that exact same day, she was online, posting videos of the family getting dressed up for prom, talking about her babies, talking about a forever she still believed in. She had no idea. Or maybe she did, and she was just holding her whole world together with trembling hands while the ground silently opened beneath her. The signs were there if you were paying close enough attention. In the first week of June, just days before the whole world found out about the divorce, he performed at one of the biggest country music festivals of the entire year. A stadium filled with thousands of people who adored him. And someone finally noticed his hands. The wedding ring was gone. For a man who had permanently tattooed his devotion to this woman across his own body, an empty ring finger glowing under those massive stage lights wasn't some small detail. It was a confession he was making without ever speaking a single word into the microphone. It was him telling the world, without words, that something had already ended long before anyone knew about it. Then there was Bunnie, behaving exactly the way she always did when the world expected her to fall apart. Which was by refusing to break where anyone could watch her do it. Just hours before the news exploded across every screen in the country, she posted a photograph of herself looking strong and free. She wrote that she was finally getting her sparkle back. She lip-synced along to an old rock song about remembering who you truly are underneath all the noise. The message was clear to anyone paying attention. She was reclaiming herself. But what happened next was different. When the news finally broke on the 15th of June, the world went into overdrive trying to figure out what went wrong. Everyone had theories. Everyone had guesses. Everyone was searching for the one moment, the one incident, the one betrayal that could explain how two people who survived so much could suddenly just quit. But nobody got the real answer. Not until he decided to finally speak about it. At 41 years old, Jelly Roll sat down and admitted something that the marriage had never allowed him to say out loud. He admitted that their entire relationship had been built on a foundation that required both of them to keep choosing the same shape, the same boundaries, the same understanding of what they were to each other. And somewhere along the way, that stopped working. He didn't blame her. He didn't say she changed. He didn't say she wanted something different. He simply admitted that the rules they'd created together, the freedom they'd defined together, the unusual marriage they'd built together, couldn't survive what success did to them. Success pulled them in different directions. Success gave them both what they'd always wanted, which meant they no longer needed each other to survive. And when you're married to someone based on survival, based on choosing each other because nobody else would, what happens when you suddenly don't need to choose each other anymore? That's what he admitted at 41. That's the uncomfortable truth that nobody wanted to hear. By every sign available to us, these two are trying to end this the same careful way they survived everything else. Quietly. Privately. On their own terms. The people surrounding them keep returning to that same gentle phrase. A mutual decision. A private family matter. That phrase is a door closing softly in your face. But sometimes that's the most dignified thing two people can do. He threw himself straight back into a massive tour. Not as an escape. Not as a way to avoid dealing with what happened. But as a way to keep moving forward. He's doing what he knows how to do. He's performing. He's creating. He's doing the thing that made him famous in the first place. And by all accounts, he's doing it well. She did something different. She's visibly begun reclaiming her own identity. Posting about her sparkle slowly returning. Stepping back into the spotlight as a woman who flatly refuses to be defined by any man, even one she clearly loved this deeply for this long. She's not hiding. She's not disappearing. She's becoming herself again. The self that existed before the van. Before the chapel. Before the fame that pulled them in opposite directions. And here's the thing that most people miss about their divorce. They still share the children they raised together. That bond doesn't just vanish because a marriage finally does. They're still connected. They're still tied to each other through the kids they built their family around. That's not something you just walk away from. That's something you carry forever. What's strange about how this all played out is the dignity in it. There were no leaked screenshots thrown into the world. There was no ugly public war waged across social media. There were no tell-all interviews where either of them tried to destroy the other person's reputation. Two people who first met as the most unlikely pair imaginable, who somehow survived a van, a betrayal, a sudden explosion of fame, and a heartbreaking fight to start a family, simply looked at one another and quietly decided that loving each other no longer meant staying together. Most people don't do that. Most people take their pain and weaponize it. Most people use their platforms to make sure everyone knows exactly how badly the other person hurt them. But they didn't. They chose silence instead. Maybe that was the most loving gift they had left to offer each other. After everything they'd been through, after all the pain and all the survival and all the rebuilding, they gave each other the gift of a quiet ending. No drama. No destruction. Just two people who looked at what they'd built together and decided that the best way to honor it was to let it go with grace. That's what 41-year-old Jelly Roll finally admitted. Not in some big confession. Not in some dramatic interview. But in the way he and Bunnie XO chose to end things. Most of us will never experience what they experienced. We'll never know what it's like to go from sleeping in a van to selling out stadiums. We'll never know what it's like to have millions of people invested in our relationship. We'll never know what it's like to fight for a family with every ounce of our being and then watch it transform into something completely different. But all of us know what it feels like when something we built with our own hands starts to fall apart. All of us know what it feels like when the rules we created together slowly stop working. All of us know what it feels like when two people who once fit perfectly together suddenly start looking like strangers. Success isn't what destroyed their marriage. Neither was the betrayal or the addiction or the pain. What destroyed their marriage was the exact same thing that destroys most marriages. Growth. Change. The fact that human beings are not statues. We evolve. We shift. We become different versions of ourselves. And sometimes the person you loved 5 years ago isn't the person you need today. Jelly Roll at 41 is not the same person who slept in a van at 31. Bunnie at the peak of her podcast success is not the same person who got sober to raise his children. They changed. They grew. They built empires that neither of them could have predicted. And somewhere in that transformation, they became people who no longer fit inside the boundaries they'd created together. That's not a failure. That's not a tragedy. That's just the reality of loving someone while you're both becoming someone new. The twins they were planning to welcome together? Those babies changed everything. Because suddenly, this wasn't just about the two of them anymore. It was about bringing new life into a situation that was already fracturing. And maybe that's why he made the decision he made. Maybe at 41 years old, looking at the possibility of becoming a father to twins while his marriage was quietly dissolving, he realized that the most loving thing he could do was let her go before it got worse. We don't know exactly what happened in those final silent months. We probably never will. But what we do know is that two people who survived the impossible decided that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit when it's time to stop fighting. Most of us spend our whole lives trying to save things that are already gone. Most of us hold on long past the point where holding on just causes more pain. But these two, for all their mess and their pain and their mistakes, managed to do something that very few people ever do. They let each other go with love instead of destruction. If you've ever felt like you were holding on to something that was already slipping through your fingers, you understand exactly what this story is really about. And if you've ever had the courage to let something go because you loved it enough to know it was time, then you understand what Jelly Roll finally admitted at 41. Sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when the story needs to end. Do you think he made the right decision, or should they have fought harder to save it? Drop your honest opinion in the comments below, because stories like this deserve to be discussed.